Did you do interviews on the Man in the Iron Mask junket?
Yes.
Yes.
And I'm feeling like we met on
yes,
that.
because I thought that we probably had met during that time.
Okay.
All right. Randall, welcome to Dallas.
No, it's so good to be here with you.
It's always a treat when we get someone of your caliber to come in and talk about the film. And in this case, we're talking about We Were Soldiers. I must tell you, just background-wise, my brother, one of my brothers, was in the Korean War and was severely injured. Ultimately lost one leg, and then as years went on, lost the other leg. So some of the action of this film was very reminiscent of some of the things that I remember him talking about. So the film resonates in a very personal way with me. But this is your second film to direct.
Yes. Yes, my fourth as a writer and my second as a director.
Yes, and your writing credits now are...
Well, I wrote Braveheart and then wrote and directed Man in the Iron Mask, and I wrote Pearl Harbor, but didn't have anything to do with the filming of that movie, and then wrote and directed this film, We Were Soldiers.
Was this the ultimate challenge for you, writing and directing this film?
It was, and at the same time, it was such a labor of love. The people that this film is about are so inspiring. Both the soldiers and their wives and their families. I would get letters from the women who had lived through this. They would share with me some of their most personal remembrances. One of them would sent me the last love letter that she wrote her husband, which was returned to her marked confirmed deceased. And when I would get letters from some of these people, I'd have to shut the door of my office and compose myself because they were so stirring. And they shared with me what the families went through. The courage shown by the men on this battlefield was matched by the courage shown by their wives at home, trying to raise their families and keep them together. And when the losses inevitably came, the way they pulled together and shared what they went through. It was so powerful and such a great model to me for what it means to be an American.
I think that it helps people to know that these people in the movie are real people. Colonel Moore, played by Mel Gibson, the Sergeant Major, the journalist, these are real people.
Yes.
How much, I know they had input, but how much control did they have over the film?
Well, I have to say they didn't have any control over the film. They had inspiration and at the same time I have to make clear I was not free to improvise, to invent incidents in this movie. I felt that these people had been betrayed by politics, and they felt that themselves. The preface of the book on which this story is based says, Hollywood has gotten the story of Vietnam wrong every time, whetting twisted political knives on the bones of our dead brothers. They felt that, they believed it, and I believed that too. And so I was determined that this not be a political movie, that this movie would just be about what they went through, what they and their families went through, and that America would look at that and could embrace them, and that the person who said we should support our boys in Vietnam and the person who said we should get our boys out of Vietnam could both look at this film and put all politics aside and say this is what these people went through, and we can embrace them and give them the welcome home and the honor that they deserve, that they never got.
This particular incident, this particular campaign, was it atypical or was it typical of many such campaigns?
Well, this was atypical not only in Vietnam, but in my view in all battles. Colonel Moore, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, the character that Mel Gibson plays in this movie, is a rarity. He's rare leadership in any place, in any time, even in America, as great as our leaders have been at times. He was a man who stood in front of his troops and said, "I can't promise I'll bring you all home alive, but I swear that when we go into a fight, I'll be the first one to put his foot on the field, and I'll be the last off. And I will not leave until every one of you is off, dead or alive. So help me God." And he meant it, and they knew he meant it. And that kind of leadership is extraordinary in any case. You know, most movies are about some kind of maverick. They're about a person that goes outside the bounds and figures out a way to do things that's unconventional. And there's something great about being unconventional. That's essentially American too. But this was a character who had a code and was rare because he actually lived up to the code he espoused.
Is that a true incident where he sent word back to Westmoreland that he couldn't leave the battlefield, he couldn't go back to be debriefed?
He was ordered 3 times to leave his men on the battlefield and go back to be debriefed, and he refused that order 3 times because he would not leave his men in the middle of the fight. He said the order was cowardly, and he would not obey such an order.
Did he ever say how that went over with Westmoreland?
Well, he did, and the way the higher ups, the people in the chain of command above him, viewed that refusal was that it was his call, and that when they were asking him to come back to be debriefed, that they didn't know how desperate the situation was. So if he felt the order was inappropriate, it was appropriate for him to tell them so. So he was not court-martialed or punished for that. In fact, he was respected for what he had done. He became one of the most respected figures in the whole Army. In fact, right now, I went with him when I was preparing to make this film. I went with him to Fort Benning, and we walked into an infantry regiment together, and it was like going into a guitar store with Elvis. These guys view him as the ultimate soldier, and he is.
His personality, is it anything at all like Mel Gibson's?
Well, it is, and interestingly enough, Mel soaked in Hal more and became so much like him, right down to absorbing his posture. It's strange. Mel is such a magnificent actor, of course. He is an instinctive actor. He acts from his heart, not from his head. As brilliant as Mel is, it's an instinctive ability that he has. And when I took Mel back to first meet General Moore, he's now retired, a general, and the two of them were sitting together at Julie Moore's dinner table. And Julie had a big dinner for all of us, and Hal and Mel were sitting there together, and the two were leaned together, and their heads were together, and they were talking. And it was like Mel was downloading Hal's heart directly from Hal's chest. And he just became him. He absorbed everything about him. And the way I view that is that any character finds something in ourselves. When somebody strikes a note within us, they do that because there's something within us that responds to what they are brave enough to let show within themselves.
I think for myself, Randall, this is the most realistic, most graphic war movie I've ever seen. And some of those scenes, I don't have to tell you, are really difficult. And yet, we can't say that it isn't valid, because I guess that war is horrific beyond anybody's imagination. But my question is, did Paramount Pictures ever try to get you to soften some of the violence or edit it down a little bit?
No, there was never any pressure from the studio to ask me to tone down the reality of the film. And I think part of that may have been because of the way our audiences, our test audiences, were reacting. When we tested this film, we were all astonished. First of all, the movie tested higher even than Braveheart. It has the same spirit as Braveheart has, and people respond to it in the kind of uplifting, emotional way that Braveheart elicited from them. But women, even more than men, love this story. And I think it is because the story is not just about the event. I am not fascinated by what a bullet does when it hits a human body. I am fascinated by who that human being is who inhabits that body. And that's what we do in this story. We know who these boys are. So the preoccupation is not with their wounds, but is with the heart and soul of the characters, and that's what moves people emotionally. It's a much more emotional movie than it is a physical movie.
One of the scenes that got to me as much as any of the war violence was when a taxi cab delivered the telegram telling the family that their soldier was lost.
Right.
And that really happened?
Yes. And I can tell you honestly, I knew I had to make this movie when I came across that story. The stories of battle were fascinating to me. They were dramatic, they're stirring, they're moving. But finding out that when the stories of the casualties, the reports of the casualties came into these families, and that no one was prepared for that to occur. They didn't have chaplains ready or counselors ready, and that the way the people were informed was for a cab to pull up to a house and knock on the door and hand a woman a telegram that said her husband was dead, and that when Mrs. Moore found out that that was what was going on, she went to the cab company and said, look, you have to just bring these telegrams to me, knowing that every time they brought her a telegram, it could be for her, because her husband was in the thick of it. He was not a leader who led from behind his men. He was a man who led from the front. So she knew every time she saw a telegram that it could be hers. And the courage that required was as great or greater than any courage I've ever heard of. So when we were filming those scenes, I would look around and see in the eyes of the crew how moved they were. It was hard for me as well to watch, but the only way I know to write a movie or to direct a movie is to go to what stirs me, to what moves my heart. I feel if it moves me, then it must surely move others.
Now, a couple of these characters, the real people, have Texas connections, don't they?
Absolutely.
Okay, tell me about that.
Well, Joe Galloway, who is a co-author of the book, and is a central figure, he was not a soldier, but he flew into the battlefield when even some soldiers were afraid to fly into the battlefield. Joe Galloway is from Texas, and also a number of the characters who are pivotal in this are from Texas. There's sort of I myself am a Southerner. I grew up in Tennessee, so I share the whole Davy Crockett, Sam Houston connection with Texas, and I know the spirit that exists among a group of people who say, if our country is being threatened, if it is required that men should stand up and go fight for their country, then let it be me. And that is the spirit that exists here. It's a spirit that exists in the South. It also, of course, existed all across the country. But the difference between now and then is that we view, in the wake of September the 11th, I mean, September the 11th taught us, reminded us, that there is such a thing as evil in the world. And there's also such a thing as courage and sacrifice and duty and honor and country. And now, everyone involved with September the 11th, we appreciate and we honor. But those men that went in 1965 to Vietnam to battle communism, being told that they were doing that to protect these defenseless human beings from slavery and horrible oppression and slaughter, those men that went to do that were just as convinced that they were fighting evil as the men that we've sent to, and women that we've sent to Afghanistan in recent months. But when those boys got back from Vietnam, instead of being treated like the heroes that so many of them were, they were treated with dishonor, as if they had somehow been villains. And I can't bear the burden of all of that. I told our actors when we were making this film, don't feel like you can make it all right. But we are going to do something here that tells the truth. And as the Bible tells us, the truth will make you free. And if we can tell the world what these men went through, and women, then we can have done something to give them the welcome home that they never got.
Did Colonel Moore ever share with you his thoughts about how the Vietnam vets were treated when they got home?
Well, absolutely. And he said to me, I mean, one of the things that's the most powerful for me is that he has never forgiven himself that any of his men didn't come home. And when I first got involved with this story and I went to Fort Benning with him, he took me to the graves of every one of his men buried at Fort Benning and said a prayer over every one of them. This man goes to chapel every day, to commune with the spirits of his men. And he believes he's going to see them again. So his connection with those family, and he visited every family as well, he and his wife. His connection with them goes to this day. So his feeling was, you know, we didn't do this for people to approve of us. We didn't do it expecting that everyone would understand. But we understand each other, and we have to stick together. And so their loyalty is not based on whether other people approved or recognized their courage. And that is one of my definitions of integrity. It's to answer to what you believe is the highest self in you, and to answer to your God, however you understand God to be, but to answer to that more than you answer to what other people think of you. It's great to have a good reputation, but more important is what you believe about yourself.
This campaign, I Drang, is that the way you say it?
Yes.
I Drang. How many men were involved in that particular campaign that you depict in the film?
Colonel Moore had 395 men in his command. He was supposed to have almost 600, but the Army could not send all of his men because of political decisions in Washington that didn't call Vietnam a war, so they didn't extend the enlistment. So he should have had 600 or more. He ended up with 395. He flew into the Ia Drang Valley looking for the enemy. He was ordered to find the enemy and kill the enemy. And he flew in with his first 60 men, and they were immediately surrounded by over 4,000 North Vietnamese. And the battle then ensued. And every one of his men who flew in to reinforce him knew that he was unlikely to get out alive. But every one of his men knew that he would not leave them, so they would not leave him. And ultimately, 395 men went into that battle, and they fought for 56 hours.
And how many casualties?
Well, there were 79 Americans killed in that battle. Actually, 80 if you include a pilot who was killed, who was not part of their unit, but they consider one of their brothers. So 80 Americans were killed in the fighting, and over 1,800 North Vietnamese were killed. And that was not an estimate, that was actual body count. And then the wounds and the shattered lives, and you have to understand how that resonates for every family out from that. But beyond that was that the Army, the Army structure, because of how bravely his men had fought and how effectively they had fought, then believed that we could win the war with those same tactics, that we would kill so many more of them than we lost, that all we had to do was keep committing men. And what they didn't recognize was the commitment of the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese were willing to lose 1 million dead, and did.
One last question, Randall. How much support and what kind of support did you get from the Pentagon?
The Pentagon was extremely helpful. At the same time, there was a limit to what they could do for us. The Pentagon is approached by every movie. And I think as formidable as the formal support of the Army was, even more helpful was the individual support of the men who had been to Vietnam and their families. This book, they consider the finest book about Vietnam and warfare they're ever written. And it's not just about Vietnam, it's what it means to be a soldier and the wife or the child of a soldier. And so these men who are, and women who serve our country in that way, view this book with a certain kind of fervor. So when it came time to needing help from somebody, when they knew what we were trying to do and they understood how committed we were to making it happen correctly, then they would do anything they could to make it work. And that was stirring. I went to Ranger School before I filmed this. I had not been a soldier myself, so I contacted them and said, I want to train with the toughest and finest you have. I want to see what it's like. And they took a look at me and said, all right, if you're up for that, then we're up for giving it to you. And everybody had that same kind of attitude. If you're willing to try, then we'll go that extra mile with you. And it was going the extra mile that made this film what it is.
When they made you an honorary ranger, did they give you a certificate or something?
You know, they did. They gave me a certificate, and it was one of my happiest moments. My time there with them was fantastic. I can tell you a little story. The Rangers have a word they use, and it's hua. And you'll hear Ranger units go, hua. And they use this word all the time. And when they made me an honorary ranger, I was surprised. I didn't know that was going to happen. And I told them that when I got to Ranger School, I heard that word hua, and I wanted to know, being a writer, I wanted to know its exact meaning. They use it to say, yes, sir, and they use it as if they mean, I understand. They even say prayers, and instead of saying amen, they say hua at the end of the prayer. So at the very last day of Ranger School for me, I was hanging off a single strand of rope in mountain school. I was 2,000 feet above the stone floor of Mount Yonah in Georgia. And my boots had blood in them because my blisters had all popped. And I had a bruise from the point of my knee to the point of my hip, and I didn't remember how it had gotten there. And I couldn't catch a good breath of air because my rib muscles were ripped from something else I'd done in Ranger School. And I was hanging off this rope, and I looked down at 2,000 feet below me, and I said to myself, who thought this was a good idea? and I had only myself to blame because I wanted to go. But I like to tell the Rangers that story, and they understand because what they've gone through to serve their country is remarkable.
I thought you were probably also going to ask them as a writer, and how do you spell hua?
Yeah, I think they would say it's not written. You have to have it in here.
Well, Randall, thank you again for coming, and I wish you the very best with the film.
Thank you so much. It's a delight to be here.
I think that not only is it a story, but it's a point of view that everybody in this country needs to know about.
Oh, thank you. God bless you.
Thanks. It's really good. Stay where you are. Now he's going to
get
move
an
the
overshow.
camera around, yeah. And are they ringing your bell?
Yeah.
Well, we're just about finished. If you
No,
need
we
to.
were right on time, I think, huh?
Yeah.
Probably, too. Just saying the same thing over and over. I know in Man in the Iron Mask, the question would, when people only have time for a couple questions, is, well, what's it like to work with Leonardo? So.
I hate that question.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
Well, that's the thing with, I've been doing this for, more years than you are old, probably. The challenge is to try to come up with questions that maybe are different, or at least not take the easy, simple way out. What's it like to work with Mel Gibson,
Yes.
I hate those questions. I'm too much of a professional to even ask a question like that,
Right.
because I don't want to ask the question that everybody else asks.
Right.
So she's yanking me, pulling me down the hall and shoves me in this room, So when I walked in and Mel knew me from previous times, he said to me, "Where the hell have you been?" And I said, "At Mass, praying for your sinful soul." And And we had the best interview ever, you know.
Yeah,
But
I
I've
bet.
always found, you know,
About Hal going to Mass every day. And he said, what does he pray for? And I said, well, Mel, I think he prays for the souls of his men. And Mel had just started building a chapel. You know, Mel is a really conservative Catholic.
Yes, I know
he doesn't even, he doesn't think the Mass ought to be said in the vernacular. He wants it in Latin. And he has a priest who will come and say the Latin too. So Mel said, when Hal comes to Los Angeles, I'd like to have a Mass said for his soldiers. And so, and he did. And I took Hal out to Mel's chapel, and Mel had a Mass said. And that was where those two men became bonded. They became like father and son, Mel and Hal.
it's Mel's private chapel?
Well, other people come. It's
I
not,
see.
but he's using his own money now. He'd probably be angry with me for telling that. I know I can share that with you, but he's not doing it for
No.
anyone to know.
No,
It is
I
strictly, for him, it is purely
Yeah.
an act of personal devotion, that he wanted to have this kind of Mass, and he couldn't find it anywhere else. And he found a little piece of property near where he lives, and he bought it, and he's building a church on it.
How marvelous. That's great.
So,
Okay, you know the drill. I'll ask the question, you start to answer it, and I'll wave
Sure.
you off. And we're not recording your end of it. Okay, we're ready? One of the scenes shows where a taxi cab is delivering the telegram to the family to tell them their soldier is dead. Did that really happen?
that really did happen. That was the way it worked for them. They didn't know this was going to be happening. They didn't have any preparations for doing this. They didn't have chaplains. They didn't have counselors. But no one.
That's good. Okay. Did it really happen that Colonel Moore ignored General Westmoreland's order to come back and be debriefed?
Colonel Moore refused the order to leave his men. He refused that order 3 times. It didn't always come from the very highest ranks. It just came down the chain of command. But he was ordered by his superiors to get on the helicopter and get out.
All right. Some of the scenes are extremely graphic in violence. Some of the scenes which are so graphic in violence makes me wonder, did Paramount Studios try to get you to edit that down and tone it down?
Well, the movie shows the horror of war. We wanted to show war as it really is, but the studio never objected to that because we had the emotional balance in the story. We let people know who they were.
Did Colonel Moore ever share with you his thoughts about how Vietnam vets were treated when they came home?
He did, and he denied that any of his men were ever spit on. He didn't think he would allow that to happen, but he's a very proud man.
Okay. Did you get any military support from the Pentagon?
Well, the Pentagon offered us all the support they were able to give us. They allowed us to film at Fort Benning in the actual locations where these men were. When you see the houses, those are the houses these men lived in. They walked down the streets they walked down.
Okay. Lyle, you are on a 2-shot, aren't you?
No, I'm not.
Oh, no. I needed a 2-shot. I'm sorry. We haven't worked together in a long time. I should have told you. Okay, I'm going to have to do
Sure.
something sober.
Two-shot?
Yeah, just stay on a 2-shot now. Okay. Some of the scenes have very graphic war violence. Did Paramount Studios ever try to get you to tone that down?
The studio never raised an objection about the realistic depiction of war because we weren't fascinated with the actual wounds themselves.
Did Colonel Moore ever share with you his thoughts about how Vietnam vets were treated when they came home?
Absolutely, and you know, it wasn't even a mystery for him. He's extremely clear.
Did it really happen that Colonel Moore ignored orders from Westmoreland to come back and be debriefed?
He received the order from the highest chain of command that said that he had to get out of that battlefield, and he refused to do it.
For me, one of the most graphic scenes is when, for me, one of the most memorable scenes is when the taxi cab driver delivered the telegram to the family to say that they had lost their soldier. Did that really happen?
Absolutely. That happened 79 times. And it was just one of the tragedies of the war about how the families were treated.
Now, I didn't ask the questions this way, but your answer will fit. What did you hope to achieve with this film?
I hope that this film would help America heal, that the people who said bring our boys home and the people who said support our boys would be able to join hands at the end of this movie and say we were all having our heart in the right place. We were all in this together.
That's fine. Okay.